Hyvää Millaisen kansalaisvaikuttamisen ja edistän päivää. Happy Millaisen Civic Engagement and Organizations Day, and I'm not going to do the last one. I'm sorry to my Estonian friends. You need to tell me how it's done afterwards. Welcome to this event. Very happy that we're going to be able to see Soviet hippies, and we have the documentarist terapiamuotojen here present as well. We'll be discussing with her and other panelists after the documentary, but I'm going to give a bit of a context of why we're here, who we are, and what do we do. My name is Aleksi Upli. I'm a board member of Humane ja Päihdepolitiikka ry, Finnish Association for Humane Drug Policy. We've been around since 2001, so next year we're celebrating quarter of a century of existence. We do all kinds of events and discussions, and we try to comment on current drug policies. We have plenty of our board members here and our director as well. And we have a bit of a stand, so please feel free to come and talk to us during the break or after the event. We also are very pleased that we have Psykedeeliavusteiset, the Association for Finnish Psychedelic Education and Culture. This is, I think, our first joint event together. So very, very pleased with that. Thank you for becoming part of this adventure. I want to recognize that we got a small grant from the Otto A. Malm Foundation to put this together. Thank you for them. The reason partly why we're here is this. There's a EU Citizens Initiative going on at the moment, which is trying to raise 1 million signatures across Europe. We have until mid-January to collect those signatures, and the goal of the initiative is to have European Commission to support 3 actions. One is about standards of psychedelic care across Europe, more EU-funded research into psychedelic therapies, and a common position for the EU in the international conventions, namely Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which is every year in Vienna. Where we are is that we are, by numbers, kind of leading Estonia by not a lot, but because it's basically based on also the portion of the population, they are actually kind of ahead of us. So congratulations to the Estonians for collecting those signatures. So we are kind of far behind at this moment, but if you recall the Finnish citizens initiatives, there's been 3 successful ones in the past years, 2 about cannabis and 1 about safe consumption rooms, and they all managed to get 50,000 signatures. So the goal for Finland to get about 11,000 signatures, but it's not impossible. We can still do that. I thought I'd ask how many has signed, but let's keep that little poll. But if you haven't signed, there's information about the initiative they can check. We have a blog post on our website about it as well, so do check that out. This is something from a website called Psychedelic Alpha. It's a psychedelic drug development tracker. And you can see from here the amount of clinical trials currently being conducted of various psychedelic substances. The outer ring is preclinical drug discovery, and then the closer you get to the bullseye, the closer you get in clinical trials. So the bullseye is where everybody's aiming for. That's when you get market approval for that therapy that they're developing. And so far, there's only one, Spravato, it's a ketamine nose spray by Janssen & Janssen, a big pharma player that has managed to get through all the ethical and practical hurdles to get their ketamine spray approved for treatment-resistant depression. I'm pretty sure some of these will get to that bullseye in the next few years, which will get there first, and what does it really mean in terms of patient access remains to be seen, but it's quite exciting. In terms of policy, there's been a lot of local initiatives and state initiatives in the US, for instance, where they've basically legalized in some forms or decriminalized the use of psychedelics in a lot of different states. This is kind of very familiar kind of looking map if you looked at cannabis states 10 years ago. So it's a similar kind of development that happened with cannabis, first medical cannabis, and then recreational came after that as well. So there's all kinds of movements going on in the US. We'll see what happens on federal level. What's going on in Europe? I mean, the European Medicine Agency has been quite open and helpful as well. They wrote a few articles about how they can be of assistance and what kind of ethical and practical challenges they see with psychedelics, but they are still kind of on board. There was a big funding by Horizon Europe, which is an EU funding body, in terms of, I think it was 6.5 million euros to give for investigating psilocybin-assisted therapy for relieving existential anxiety in palliative care. It's been traditionally with cancer patients. This is non-cancer patients. So there was, I don't remember exactly. I think it was 4 indications: MS and ALS, and then those kinds of non-cancer conditions. But terminal illnesses where there's a lot of anxiety, that psilocybin can maybe relieve. There was a statement in the European Economic and Social Committee report saying that there should be more funding for psychedelic therapies, in particular for major depression, PTSD, and alcohol dependence. Germany and Czech Republic have recently amended or are in the process of amending their legislation to allow medicinal use of psilocybin. I think in Czech Republic also MDMA. The Dutch government had a report in 2024. In it, there was, among other things, a recommendation to have these kind of large-scale naturalistic studies to make MDMA-assisted therapy available for patients. So there's all kinds of things going on in Europe. Well, I'll really briefly tell about the Finnish history, because in the 50s there was quite positive media reporting about this remarkable drug that turns patients into a little child. So that was Helsingin Sanomat in 1954 about LSD, and they said it might become a great importance in the diagnosis and treatment of certain mental illnesses. A few years later, in Helsingin Sanomat again, there was a foreign correspondent who reported about the treatment of more severe psychosis by a Swedish doctor using a sensational drug called LSD. They mentioned that this is a miracle drug that will revolutionize the world. Albert Hoffman, the founder of LSD, actually visited Finland in 1960. He was invited as a research guest of the Biochemical Society, hosted by A.I. Virtanen, who's the only Nobel Prize winner in chemistry that Finland has. Last bicycle day, we were trying to follow the kind of path that Albert was here. He was sleeping in the hotel not too far from here. He's had dinner and I think I forgot, I'm sorry, but basically we tried to follow his path in that last bicycle day. Maybe we'll do it next year as well. In the 60s, there was some sort of experiments with LSD, or Delucid, which was the brand name that Sandoz developed, or Hoffman while he was working for Sandoz. And apparently here in Lapinlahti Hospital as well, they did some experimentations. There's not really too much documentation of it. Maybe there are some psychiatric archives that has some sort of patient's reports, but at least there wasn't any publications that I know of. Maybe somebody else knows. But apparently one of the healthy volunteer test subjects was Vappu Taipale, who later became the Social Minister of Health and Welfare, and also the director of Stakes, which was before Kela. Apparently in a media article or interview, he said, like, yeah, it was worth doing. And then this whole moral panic, like, how can you say that? It's about LSD, and like this whole moral panic started, and he had to kind of say, I'm sorry, as you usually do. Anyway, closer to modern day, in Finland at least, there's been funding by Kone Foundation and Finnish Foundation for Alcohol Studies. They've funded non-clinical psychedelic research in recent years. There's been plenty of publications by Finnish researchers. You can see below some examples. They're not by all means all of them. So there's been increasing research. There's a new peer-reviewed journal called Acta Psychedelica that started this year. It's been discussed in medical reviews and some in Finnish media as well, quite positively in recent years. There's an article by Tsubari and Katainen that was accepted in Sociologia, where they kind of see that the media discussion has changed from a moral threat to potential medicine and a business opportunity. The first and so far only international clinical psychedelic study of the 2000s that was partially conducted in Finland ended up in the bankruptcy of the Canadian sponsor, and the study results have not yet been published, and I was part of that, coordinating one of the sites, and unfortunately I don't have much more information to tell you about whether it's going to be published or not. The data is technically by this Canadian bankruptcy entity, and we don't really know what's going to happen to it. But there's the first private ketamine clinic that has been established. There's also a pharmaceutical startup company called Kasvu Therapeutics that's developing so-called neuroplastogens based on a finding that they did at Helsinki University a few years ago, showing that psychedelics also bind to, I'm sure there's some neuroscientists here that can say this a lot better, but not only the serotonin H2A receptor, but some sort of TRP channel as well, and it's more potent than antidepressants in locking in those receptors, something like that. But they now have a company that's trying to pursue that finding as well. And under my interpretation of the Finnish law of prescribing, when they technically legalized medical cannabis in 2008 by making this asetus, it doesn't mention cannabis, it mentions the UN treaties, and says that these can be prescribed if there's a medical need. It's been only technically applied to medical cannabis because it's something to prescribe, but under my, at least interpretation, it would allow prescribing of all of the UN treaty substances. So, you know, we're quite far ahead in that game, because already in 2008 we made every substance on the UN treaties legally to be prescribed. We haven't really taken advantage of that possibility, but it's there under my interpretation. Just a quick show of our little research environment in Kouvola, A-Klinikka Oy Rehabilitation Center, where we had our little study. The patients came in from that little door, and that's in the right corner, left corner down there. It was like a social worker's office, but we made it into a nice little treatment center or room where people just basically laid on a bed with their ice shades and headphones and had 25 milligrams of psilocybin or a placebo. And this is a little poster that they made for us because we didn't want people to, or the staff to walk in, so they made this nice little poster for us, even though I think that's Amanita muscaria, not psilocybin mushroom, but still it was a very nice effort. Also this year, we're having the third psychedelic conference, Finnish one, starts actually tomorrow in Turku. We have, I think, about 10 spots left, so if you're interested, we are in kind of the European conference world. We're the cheapest one, so you know you have to travel to Turku and spend a few nights there, but still I think it's definitely worth it. We have a great program with great keynotes and a great after party with a psychedelic circus theme, but there's more information on that website. Also coming in the near future, there's going to be an audiobook of this science book of the year. A little self-promotion, never hurt anybody. The live, material book is over there. You can buy it for 20 euros with a signature. Good deal. And there's another one in the making. Hopefully we'll have it published by next year's Bicycle Day. It's called Psykodeeliavusteiset. So, some references for these, but without further ado, I want to welcome you all to this event, and we're going to start watching this great documentary that Terry made already in 2017, I remember. I saw it in Amsterdam myself for the first time, so we'll see how it works through all these years. I'm looking forward to it. We're going to close these curtains, and we're going to start the documentary. It's about 75 minutes long. Then we're going to have a small break. We're going to go to the bathroom. There's plenty of them just outside these doors, and then we're going to have the panel discussion. If you can't stay for the panel discussion, please feel welcome to kind of browse what's on the tables from our associations. And thank you for being here. Thank you. All right. We are now in this part of our program. So panel discussion. I am still Aleksi from the Finnish Association for Humane Drug Policy. I'll be moderating this panel, and the topic indeed is civic engagement and psychedelic therapies in Europe or their future. I would first like all of you to introduce yourselves, who you are, what do you do in most of your days, and what does that have to do with either civic engagement or civic activism or psychedelic therapies or both. So let's start with Juuso.
Okay, hello everyone, and thanks for inviting me. I'm Juuso Kähnen. I'm board member in the Finnish Association for Psychedelic Research and doing my PhD in Helsinki University related to value changes associated with psychedelics. Yeah, so kind of philosophically analyzing how psychedelic experiences affect values. Also, I've been some years ago been also in the Humane Drug Policy Association, and I'm like broadly interested in these questions, and also my research touches on them.
Hello, I'm Oliver Berg. I'm from Estonia, and I'm one of the founders and the executive director of TYPE Foundation. So TYPE is short for Foundation for Therapeutic Advancement and Innovation with Psychedelics, which means that in Estonia we are the multi-stakeholder engagement civic organization that we try to create the conditions in Estonia, the policy changes, so that therapeutic practices with psychedelics would be more available. Because right now it's only available with ketamine, similar to maybe in Finland right now where the first clinic was opened. So we are working together with experts among mental health care with psychiatrists and clinical psychologists, and also then the policymakers to ensure that we would have more medicines available in the nearby future, hopefully.
Hello, I'm Henry Suomenmaa. I'm the chairman of the Psykedeelisen Sivistyksen Liitto, the Association for Finnish Psychedelic Education and Culture. I'm also involved with the Finnish Association for Psychedelic Research, but here today I'm in the role of the Sivistysliitto, which is focusing on advancing the wiser handling of psychedelics. In many ways, we organize events, we facilitate discussions and lectures. We're interested both in how individuals can handle psychedelics more wisely, and also how communities and societies can handle psychedelics more wisely. And we don't claim to know the answer to how that's done, but we are interested in putting up the question in different kinds of contexts, scientific and cultural and every kind. Yep.
I'm Terje Toomistu, documentary filmmaker, but I think currently my main job is being an anthropologist. I work at University of Tartu as well as Tallinn University, and I've done quite a different strands of researches, and none of them have been strictly speaking about psychedelics. So in a way, with today's main topic, I'm more on the observers, or I can expand a little bit on the history of drugs in the Soviet Union. But in Estonia, I have found myself quite a few times in a position to be a public speaker about psychedelics, partly for that reason, having made this particular documentary, but also partly perhaps that quite some time ago, over 15 years ago, I published a book, a popular novel about psychedelic experiences in South America. And that was one of the first popular texts that was out there, widely available, that documented experiences with ayahuasca, for example, or San Pedro. And perhaps that was the trace that I've been sometimes invited to be in these kind of settings to talk about psychedelic therapy or history of psychedelics. And I'm fascinated about all that has been happening in that area of research. Maybe one day I'll be able to do also actual research on that. And I'm the curious observer in that sense.
Thank you. Well, we could actually continue with you as the curious observer. Could you, from your perspective, give a few examples of civic activism in the field of psychedelics? What comes to mind?
One way to think of it is that the way we are in every day, in our behavior, in our actions, like everything matters, that everything is somehow political. So whenever we choose how we spend our time, how we deal with our wounds, with our personal traumas, or how we have fun, is already, in a wide sense, civic engagement. But of course, more narrowly speaking, this kind of activism happens in a very small settings, usually very private settings or very kind of niche festival settings, where topics as such in a small scale are spoken about. To do it in a wider sense, I think this is what my fellow panelists are doing in their work, and I much appreciate that. And I think we need more these kind of actual engagements with the public's science-backed statements in the public to shake off the taboo of psychedelics as being, historically viewed from the moral lens, the whole hippie history, especially in the West, but also in the Soviet Union, as you saw in the film, how all this kind of, how the emotional landscape was very much policed back then. Of course, in the Soviet era, it was very strict that even the way you dance or the way you laugh, the way you smile to a cashier in a shop was already a statement, and a suspicious statement. Of course, nowadays we live in a different world, but even then, the way how we, spend our time and how we deal with our traumas matters. And it still too badly creates suspicion.
Thank you. Andy, you want to start? Could you?
I'm thinking of the framing of the question. Can you sharpen it a bit?
Could you give a few examples of civic activism in the field of psychedelics or psychedelic therapies? I mean, I had a follow-up question, is the mere consumption of psychedelics already a form of civic activism because it's illegal, for instance?
Well, basically, like, I think at least publicly talking about psychedelics, not just on stage like this, but also just wherever there's people, especially people who don't necessarily know each other beforehand, talking about psychedelics can be viewed as a form of civic activism. If I think from the viewpoint of our organization, one of our sort of points of departure is that it's a fact that the use of psychedelics is increasing both in Finland and elsewhere, and the interest in psychedelics also among those who are not using psychedelics is increasing. So that's a good starting point for having discussions, and I think it's a form of civic activism to just go from that starting position. This is the fact, this is a reality, that this is happening, so how do we engage with it? How do we build a meaningful, constructive relationship with it? And the way we try to do it with our organization is that we try to facilitate spaces where it's totally okay to talk about psychedelics from any kind of perspective. So basically, people who have had good experiences, who have had bad experiences, people who have had good experiences, but also may have had long-term difficult challenges related to psychedelics, people who have had bad experiences but have had good outcomes. We want to create space for talking about all of that in a way that encourages disagreement, because I think it's really important to have disagreement when it comes to psychedelics, because they are not a single kind of thing, and there's many perspectives to them. So yeah, I think at least that can be viewed as civic activism. I think a bit more than your other question related to is just the use of psychedelics civic activism. I think it can be, but it depends on the context whether it makes sense to talk about it like that. So if I think about myself taking psychedelics for the first time a bit over 20 years ago, I don't think there was anything inherently civic activism like in that, but it became that when it started becoming more like relational, and when I noticed that there's starting to be conversations in Finland about it, because back then it was only talked about fringe, and now it's talked about by many kinds of people. So yeah, but if someone wants to view their own use of psychedelics as civic activism in itself, I think there can be good arguments for that. And for example, what we saw in the movie, I think it's more, makes more sense to view it as a form of activism the more authoritarian or totalitarian the system that the person lives in resides. So basically, like middle class people taking drugs in Helsinki is not maybe that much. I'm not saying not at all, but there, I think activism as a term usually includes some sort of risk, whether like physical risk in the case of cops threatening to beat you up if you talk your mind, or at least like reputational or social risks. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe as a follow-up, there is like an essence or a side of civic disobedience in it. Coming to your question, that whether even using psychedelics, whether that's engaging as well, and I'd say yes, it is, but maybe it's not really that much of a conscious choice most of the times. But what we try to do with the Type Foundation is, and I suppose what we're doing here tonight as well, and is also creating this discourse. I really like this, also this like, encouraging disagreements as well, that we can have actual debates where we're actually starting to talk about what psychedelics are. And in the case, what we're doing with Type is that we're really focusing on yes, their medical use in psychotherapy, because we see the need for it. We see a very, very clear need for it, and it's something as a core message. We're trying to really instill this message that we can use psychedelics as medicines, Because right now we have all this like stigmatization and taboo around them, but still this perception of they're really dangerous drugs. They're Schedule 1 drugs on the United Nations Convention, which means that by definition they should be highly dangerous to your health, highly addictive, and carry no medical significance or potential. I mean, by now we know that none of those three statements are scientifically true. They're all false, and we're trying to really spread that evidence-based information to make sure that people are just more educated, and hopefully based on that education, those knowledges, we can actually move into more of a system, a political system, legislative framework where we can actually use the potential of these compounds and then actually deal with the potential threats that they also, of course, carry.
Reflecting on the history, or largely because of the history, I think currently much of the activism around psychedelics in Finland is relatively like non-confrontational and aimed mostly at education, and also representing the science association. I think that's like one way to do kind of civic activism, to spread like accurate information and promote research. And I think also like in for sure there has been the like demonization and like overtly negative view on psychedelics, but also what we are concerned both in the science or research association and also in the PSL Henry represents is also hype, or I think there's like two problems. One is the demonization, but also there is much like hype and kind of unfounded expectations around psychedelics, and I think there is like work to both directions to kind of both remove the stigma, but also to kind of counter kind of misinformation towards the other direction. Yeah. I've been also recently reading this Acid Dreams of this history book about psychedelics, which is also very interesting to reflect how what the situation has been in the like 60s and 70s, and how there has been like extremely radical stuff going on, for example, in the United States, and like kind of extremist groups and political activists who kind of used psychedelics in like very politically loaded way. And I think it's interesting that kind of activism doesn't seem to be around at the moment.
If I can dance a bit with that, I started thinking about the word like civic activism, because in Finnish we can say kansalaisaktivismi, but we can also say kansalaisvaikuttaminen. And I don't know if there's an English word that precisely translates kansalaisvaikuttaminen. Vaikuttaminen is having an effect on something. So I think activism is more like what you do when you go on the street and demonstrate, and when you try to push for a certain agenda, but maybe kansalaisvaikuttaminen is more nuanced and maybe not as much pushing such an agenda. It's an interesting question whether like just doing science about the taboo subject is like a form of civic activism or kansalaisvaikuttaminen. I think, for example, if I think about anthropology, I think this generally as a field of science, it's tended to shake the conceptions of normal in all kinds of societies by broadening our understanding of like the diversity of how people are in the world. So yeah, it's very interesting to think about that. And also when you mentioned like the importance of having factual information to both directions, I think it's a good point that you made, that in Finland is generally quite non-confrontational, like the way psychedelics are talked about by, for example, NGOs that are related to them. And in general, I think one reason why there is quite a bit of that confrontational attitude, like historically, of course, has to do with like how strong the backlash was towards psychedelics in the 60s. And I think partly it's like compensation. So like for so many decades, psychedelics and, for example, cannabis was just talked about in a very negative tone in the media. So then I think, for example, like how in Finland, much of drug policy activism started like coming more in the public, like in the beginning of this millennium. I think quite a bit of that also had quite a bitter tone with it. And I think one of the reasons is that because of the historical oppression of even talking about it. But now I think there's much more space to discuss it just as a thing. That there doesn't have to, of course, I'm not saying that people cannot be bitter because of their own experiences or because they see unfairness, because there is a lot of unfairness related to these things, but also like, I personally think it's very interesting to just like facilitate spaces where there can be neutral discussions, or I don't know if any discussion is ever totally neutral, but still just like looking at it from many angles as it is, as it appears to whoever is looking, because different people in different positions, the same phenomena can appear in many different ways.
Thank you. History has been mentioned and the backlash of the 60s. What can we learn from the past? And as psychedelics are apparently moving to the mainstream, what kind of lessons could we learn and what kind of risks and possibilities can we take from history so we don't repeat the same mistakes again?
Well, I think we would like to see the past quite often, and I'm referring to the hippie movement in the West as a revolutionary movement that was, politically ambitious. But if you look closer to the history of it, then this kind of political ambition was just part of it, and maybe even not a central part. Or quite quickly, it evaded this kind of pop cultural lifestyle. Took over the whole scene of psychedelics with its whole revolutionary potential. And again, what the students in Berkeley were thinking in terms of civic engagement, in terms of anti-war sentiments, and what the Haight-Ashbury hippies were actually doing, and how quickly it, the whole. Let's say civic situation in the neighborhood became very complicated, and that created all this moral panic, and then backlashed the whole what the scientists had been done already for a decade. So it's definitely a lesson to learn that is it it's probably not a wise thing to take trip on acid as you're driving the school bus across the, America, or serving the LSD in a baby bath for everybody without their knowing. But this is what the merry pranksters, the early proponents of the LSD, were exactly doing. And of course, that created a different viewpoint with Tim Leary as well. But again, even with Tim Leary, we can think that was it a wise thing to engage students in their experiments at Harvard, or was it a wise thing to make LSD a sacrament of psychedelic revolution and then become a guru yourself and so on? So I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from that part of the history. From that part of the history, well, I'm still wondering how clear it was that Aare, the main protagonist, was basically a victim of unknowable drug consumption, and that actually generated his lungs issue. That was eventually the reason why he became immobile in his house. So as we went to the road trip, he had not been out of his house for 1.5 years. or like after the road pick, he was sitting in the house for another couple of years, only a couple of times to the hospital maybe. So he was actually quite immobile during his last years of his life. He just passed away 1.5 years ago. I think in the Soviet area, everything was even more, crazy, because the drugs were really harsh. LSD was not really around. LSD was in very rare occasions, but so they were compensated that lack with some things that were quite a lot radical, like for example this asthmathol tea that had combination of different psychoactive plants in it, or they were sniffing a cleaning detergent called Sopals that had an ether as its main component. They were and then opium, of course. They made a tea from poppies, and actually a lot of the film protagonists had some of their friends who they lost simply because they didn't know how to dosage the opioids. And so actually, as a result of this whole politicization of the hippie movement, the means to escape from the reality, so to speak, to create this kind of alternative spaces of resistance in their mind, because that was the site of freedom for them, quite often became also quite brutal. So some of them started drinking a lot, and some of them were experimenting with different kinds of drugs, and sometimes quite harsh ones. So I think the lesson to learn from that is that yes, we need education and awareness what we are putting into our body, and some of them hold promise for better lives or better futures, and some of them have side effects that you might not actually desire.
I could continue. I think one lesson is be slow and be strategic. Strategic. Yeah. I think those two things didn't happen in the 60s. Things happened like extremely fast, and people didn't have like that kind of long-term thinking, or maybe couldn't like predict the consequences of their style of moving things forward. And what you said, I agree that like much of the hippie culture in the 60s was decidedly apolitical, but there was this like intersection of the new left and the kind of counterculture, and like really also interesting like radical stuff was going on at organizations which like kind of tried to bring like social revolution and included psychedelics in their plans. And I'm thinking, on the other hand, what we can learn to kind of be wiser in the way we discuss and bring psychedelics to the society, but also I think some of the utopianism of the 60s, or there is definitely some like good sides to that also, but I also wonder have we lost some of that, or it seems also that the imagination about what are the possibilities concerning psychedelics, but maybe more broadly on a societal level, that has also maybe narrowed quite a bit, and I think some of that kind of imagination could be brought back. And also thinking like more broadly and even like longer stretches of history and how psychedelics have been utilized among like non-Western cultures, that there are like many societally beneficial ways to use them, and I think we could also learn from those, although it's of course perhaps best to go slow and start with the therapy.
Go slow, start low, basic harm reduction stuff.
Yeah, I don't think that I have much to add. These were all very, very concise and important points. Maybe I definitely want to underline and highlight what you also said about the danger of the hype. I think some of the hype was a bit released or scaled the last year because there was a lot of expectations building up when we saw this chart beforehand about the phases of different clinical trials, and last year Lycos Pharmaceuticals, or formerly known as MAPS, they handed in the application then to regulate MDMA assisted therapy as a form of medication, or then to deregulate the MDMA from Schedule 1, because they had passed or they had completed the phase 3 trials, the final step that you need in medicine advancement, or when you're working on medicines. And then that application was rejected. So in the field, when you look what let's say people working in the psychedelics field, how they were let's say covering it before the decision was made, kind of I would say the majority of the voice in that is basically it's a done deal, that people are really certain it's going to happen now, and things are going to move really fast onwards. And when the FDA announced its rejection, it was kind of like a bit of a shell shock in the field, and I feel it was kind of necessary to sort of get a little reality check, because once you're sort of in this bubble with your psychedelic buddies, then it's really easy to sort of forget that what the wider context is, that most of the people still don't know what's the difference between MDMA, ketamine, LSD, psilocybin, DMT. It's a lot of abbreviations and very different actual compounds, very different effects. Aren't they all just party drugs, or what's the difference? And maybe that's kind of a little nice reflection point, that kind of we sort of exhale some of the hype, and then hopefully can take it one step at a time, because I do believe it is only a matter of time. And when we see the wider use of these compounds. But yeah, given the mistakes that were made in the past, then really this responsibility that we all have moving forward is something to keep in mind, because especially for people who might be stuck in very challenging mental health states, they might be very desperate to have some sort of straw that would help them out from that situation, whether severely depressed or suffering from PTSD, and if you do these very powerful compounds, these substances in the wrong context, it can actually generate a new trauma for you, and can actually lead to self-harm as well. So that's something to keep in mind. These compounds, they're not physically addictive. They take classical psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin. They don't mess with your kidneys or liver, but that doesn't mean that they don't have their potential threats. And it's this taking care of your brain and your mental health is something that shouldn't be taken too easily. They're not magic bullets, and as far as we know, they just, if used in the right setting, they can help us to do the inner work. Maybe open up some new avenues when we have good psychological support and mental support next to us. But they can also put us, the psychedelic experiences can lead us into very, very dark corners of the mind, and we got to be mindful of that.
A couple of thoughts. First, because I'm talking about disagreement. So one disagreement that I have with the way that psychedelics are usually presented to people, especially to audiences who don't know about psychedelics. So it's constantly been emphasized that psychedelics are not addictive, and of course they are not addictive in some of the ways that really, really addictive drugs are addictive. But they're still you can form a very harmful relationship involving constant psychedelic use. And I think a good example outside of psychedelics, which makes clear how addiction is not just something chemical. So I was just watching the documentary which we're considering showing with our organization, Iboga Nights, I think. There are several interesting documentaries about Iboga, but it's that one. So it's a sort of psychedelic, and that's especially being used to help people withdraw from opioids, and it has a particularly interesting effect of completely removing the withdrawal symptoms from opioid addiction, at least for some people. And still, for many people who use that and get rid of the withdrawals, they don't stop using opioids, because addiction is so much more than just a physical addiction. And this is also why we have gambling addiction or porn addiction. They're not physical addictions in the sense that you would put a chemical in your body and then would go through withdrawal symptoms unless you get more, but there's still a profound addiction, which is of course partly chemical, even though it's not like coming from something you put in your body. So I think that's one thing I would like to talk about in a bit more nuanced ways, because usually I think psychedelics do have this self-limiting effect that when you have a good psychedelic experience, you're like, fuck, I'm never gonna do that again. And then maybe later you do. But you know, so that didn't exist, but I'm calling for nuance. But okay, to the actual question of what we can learn from the 60s, a bit like commenting on what Juuso said about taking it slow. I've been thinking quite a bit about what happened in the 60s, and because also many people are really bitter and disappointment in like that all the potential of psychedelics was just like put underground in the 60s. And yeah, we might have a wiser relationship to psychedelics now if that didn't happen. But also one perspective that I enjoy thinking about is, what if it actually offered us an opportunity to have more time to look at what psychedelics are and what they do. Of course, they have been used constantly, even though, like, regardless of prohibition, but I think it's still slowed down their adoption in our society. And I think one thing that happened in the 60s, because of course one part of it was just propaganda out of fear, but it was also fear out of recognizing that this is something very powerful. We don't know what it is. We have no clue actually how it's going to affect our society in the longer term. So if I look at it from a bit more like conservative position, it's a good idea if you encounter something that is powerful instead of just like pushing the pedal to the metal, to really take your time to learn about it. So what if we look at this, what happened in the 60s from the perspective of that part of the reaction was a healthy reaction of recognizing something that, even though it's potentially healing, it's also potentially dangerous in ways that we cannot even begin to imagine. If you remember that in the 60s, in the public domain, the first discussions about traditional use of psychedelics had appeared in the 50s, when in the Life magazine there was this article about Gordon Wasson encountering Maria Sabina and the psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico. Yeah, before that there had been some scientific research on mescaline. William James had talked about psychoactive drugs in the beginning of the 20th century, 100 years ago, but still mostly there was no like in-depth scientific or even cultural understanding about the history and use of psychedelics. So it was completely novel in many ways. And then to bring it more to this day, we've talked with Juuso quite a bit about the work of Jules Evans, who is a very interesting philosopher, who is his one special project is that he has the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences scientific project, which looks at especially about the challenging experiences and especially the long-term difficult consequences that people get from taking psychedelics and what helps those people. But Jules has also this blog called Ecstatic Integration, and the phrase ecstatic integration is referring to his idea of it's actually difficult to have a good relationship as a society and also as individuals to ecstatic transformative experiences. It's not obvious like what kind of position they should have in a society. So he's sort of advocating for this, I can't recall the term, but ecstatic, like some sivistystietoisuus, like basically advocating for a society that is actively curious about what kind of positions these sorts of experiences ought to have. And I don't think there's one answer to that. I don't think the answer is medical or religious or it can be recreational or traditional or any of that, but it's also all of those. So I think it's good that the society has an active discussion that's not like looking for definite conclusions, but is like just letting our relationship to psychedelics and in general to ecstatic transformative experiences and techniques that cause those, some of which are just like traditional religious practices, also thinking about the context for those, and also maybe like integrating the understanding that psychedelics are at least can be viewed as a part of that very diverse field or whatever. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Does anybody have anything to add at this point? We're going to go from the past to the future soon. And in the future, we're going to also open up the discussion for the audience. So if you have questions, you can start preparing yourself in your head. I mean, predicting the future is, of course, difficult. And just one side note, I didn't read the article, I just saw some sort of news that some quantum physicists somehow discovered that you usually think that what happens now affects the future, but apparently they found out what we do now also affects the past, which is a mindfuck in its own. But, and I don't know how that works, but anyway, sociology. But to think about the future, where do you see this going, and what gives you hope that things will eventually kind of go the right way? What kind of fears you might also have that things definitely not gonna work out the way we wish? What are we wishing for, actually? Like, for instance, the EU initiative is asking for standards of psychiatric care. Well, standards by who? What are the standards? More funding is always, of course, needed, but there's other things that probably need funding as well. And, having a common position of the EU, I mean, there's some things that we can't really agree on inside the EU, so how do we find a common position on this? Just a few examples, but let's, who wants to pick the mic first, thinking the road ahead?
Well, I'm actually very glad that you both pointed out in a critical way this hype around psychedelics that we've been witnessing on the way of this psychedelic renaissance. And I also like the way that you expanded the view that, what would be the role of psychedelics, not in terms of medicine, but also religion and so on. Because a lot of this hype is coming from where the money is, and the money is in the startups, and the startups are interested in the therapy, and the therapy is landing in a place where we have this huge mental health crisis, and then it is portrayed as the key, the golden key that might help a lot of people. And actually, when we translate it into real life situations where a therapy takes many hours, it needs, there used to be initial idea was that you would have a two therapists there, a woman and a man, because you don't know how the gender affects the whole situation. Now it's more likely that one is enough, and still it is very expensive. So how this whole potential lands on the market economy that we are living, and of course, the one session probably wouldn't, bring you out from the trouble you are in. You might need several sessions, and that's quite a lot of load on your pocket. And so this is where I'm usually cooled off with this whole hype that, the hype is nice, but can we actually afford it? That still eventually for a lot of people, much affordable is to go with your friend in a countryside and just do it.
Just a quick side note that came from that. There was this kind of expression, the Finnish sociologist Kettu Brun, I think in the 50s or 60s, when they were having this discussion about drugs, coined the term that drugs are a good enemy. You can blame the drugs for almost everything, and you don't have to worry about other types of inequality in the system. But in this case, the psychedelics is a good, not an enemy, but like this sort of solution that will solve everything, basically. Just a side note.
I was exaggerating, of course, to make a point.
And about psychedelics, I'm quite optimistic, or I think the cultural context is profoundly different than in the 60s, and I kind of don't see a big backlash coming, or I think the attitudes have changed quite a lot. But then given all the other problems like ecological and crumbling of the welfare state and so on, I think like given those factors, it's difficult to say like, will psychedelics make a difference? And for example, will we have a healthcare system that can afford like high quality psychedelic therapies? Or I'm more maybe concerned about other issues. One very interesting there is Urrutia and others paper a couple of years ago where they proposed this kind of integrating psychedelics as part of this kind of communal healthcare. And the point is that especially in like less affluent countries, that the current like medical system or where the kind of medical, they don't have like similar functioning like medical systems as for example here in Finland, although that also is not maybe perfectly functioning, but anyways, that they had proposed this idea that local communities should be empowered to use psychedelics and other kind of like local knowledge traditions to kind of provide affordable mental health care, which is not based on the like traditional like Western psychiatric model. And I think that's like one very interesting proposal, like what are the like kind of affordable alternatives to the kind of therapies that we are used to.
Yeah, that's definitely what I also see about like relevant about the future, that what is actually the future of our society. There was just an article in the main biggest Finnish newspaper, Helsingin Sanomat, about the road infrastructure in Finland and how we are not able to actually take care of our roads because that's so expensive, and also because we don't deal with Russia anymore, it's double the price of taking care of our roads. So that's just one example of the many things that are shaking heavily in our society, and of course all the ecological, the coming AI stuff that's already much here, the militarization, the atmosphere of war. So these are all worrying, but also I think they point towards the same direction that you just talked about, that we also need more communal approaches to this. And well, you mentioned like just going into the countryside, tripping with your friends, and I think that's probably viable for most people who are interested in psychedelics. And to use psychedelics, you don't need probably a mental health professional, but when I think about like very vulnerable people, for example, people dealing with severe trauma, taking psychedelics randomly can be really devastating, and as you mentioned before, it can be traumatic. So I think we need many approaches simultaneously. So for the people who need the mental health support, which in some capacity is probably most of us, like most people benefit from some sort of therapy, even though they don't have like devastating mental health problems. But so I think the conversation needs to go like to recognizing where are the people who actually need the professional support so they can have that. And for example, with the Finnish Association for Psychedelic Research, I'm now producing this event next month, Millainen terapeuttista, which is a training, 2-day training for people who are either working or studying in a field related to social or health services. And there the approach is twofold. So one part of the approach is, this is for people who are interested. Yeah, we're showing the poster there. So one part is, if you want to be a psychedelic therapist, this is relevant information for you. But the other part is, if you're a professional who in some capacity is going to encounter or is already encountering people who either use psychedelics or are planning using psychedelics or have used psychedelics, what kind of professional understanding helps you to support those people? So it's obvious, as you said, that the financial aspect of psychedelic therapy is very a big question mark. And the reality is that as people feel that they need more effective mental health treatments, more people are going to turn towards psychedelics. Based on the research, probably most of them will mostly get a positive effect of that. Some of them will get a really negative effect of that. So what do we do? How do we as a society right now develop both our attitudes, our understandings, and our procedures related to psychedelics? That's a really important question. And I feel no need personally to advocate for psychedelics anywhere. The positive potential that they have, I think, is already like being observed. So I think it's much more interesting and important to talk about, okay, this is happening. We don't know like to what extent it will be integrated in our society, but it's here and it's coming more and more. You know, in the beginning of the 90s in Finland, 0.2% of the population had used intoxicating mushrooms, so probably psilocybin mushrooms mostly. And now I think the percentage in the last report by THL was 5.3, so that's
17 times bigger. Like
it's quite an increase.
Quite an increase.
So this is happening. How do we, as responsible, or at least like adults who are interested in being more responsible, how do we engage with this fact right now and in the future?
Yeah, exactly, and that's where civic society has a really strong role to play. Different organizations can voice different angles of this subject, and if we're looking at what's the positives, then I do believe as well that as the slide that showed, the phases of medical trials show, I mean, of course, some of them will be discarded as always, but there will be some that will be integrated. There's strong reason to believe that, and yeah, one of the things then where civic society will have an important role to play is also how to ensure that there wouldn't be a socio-economical disparity on the access to them. So right now, as we know, most people who go to retreats in Bali or Jamaica or wherever, it's mostly people who have really high income, and maybe the people who would potentially benefit most from these compounds, they don't even know what they are, let alone they could never afford something like that. So how to ensure that even if these compounds are used in mental health care in the future, that they would be, for example, covered by the national health insurances of different states. And that's something where we need a strong civic society who would speak for that. And yeah, we're also discussing the communal aspect of it. Probably if we look at psychotherapy, then it's likely that some form of a group therapy will be used as well, depending on the compound. And I'm personally most intrigued about the 5-MeO DMT, which is currently, I believe, like the phase 2B, if I'm not mistaken, for depression. And point being that it has a short acute effect, so it can feel like a short lifetime experience, but yeah, but yeah, or a long one. But yeah, like at a regular time measured, it's the acute effect is up to 30 minutes. So pretty much you can actually integrate it into the current psychotherapy model. You can from work you can go to lunch set with your psychiatrist and actually continue working after that. So maybe that's part of the future, and then if it makes us more like caring citizens and hopefully more caring to our environment and society that we're building, because right now we're kind of building a society where we should have more and more free time because of the technological advancements. But what we see is more and more people, suffering from burnout, and we're supposed to be doing more, become more efficient, we're becoming like machines. So maybe that's, maybe these compounds can help us to sort of, re-regulate that kind of mindset as well. But yeah, like you also said as well, that what we see right now from what science is telling us, it's hard to see like such a serious backlash happening again, like happened in the 60s.
All right, anything to add? I'm gonna open the floor for some audience questions. I do wanna tell you that, as you can see, we have plenty of cameras here, so your voice will be recorded. You don't have to identify yourself or state your name. You can just ask the question, but do keep in mind that it will be recorded. And anything you say will not be used against you, I promise. But somebody else. We'll use that mic over here that Terry has, and we have first question right over here.
Okay, hi.
Whoa. Yeah.
So I have a question concerning this is a conversation that has already been had, but this is concerning the recent news about, I don't know the specifics, but using AI algorithms was this psychedelic discovery. Basically about is the psychedelic, like the trip, going to be a part of the therapeutic value of psychedelics in the future. Like there are many attempts to, and I guess now they successfully took out the psychedelic experience out of could we get the therapeutic value without the experience? And what do you think about this? Is it like a possible outcome in the future? And is this like medicalization necessarily a bad thing or a good thing, or neither, or both? So yeah, hope you understood the question.
Thank you.
I can give it some kind of a response. I think that is a topic of active debate, like what's the role of the experience for the therapeutic outcomes. And there are these lines of research developing these like non-hallucinogenic psychedelics or neuroplastogens is one term for those. And I think, it's an open question. I think it might be very possible that we in future will have like compounds that are in some respects similar to the current psychedelics but lack the trip, and they probably have some therapeutic effects, but I think it's an open question. Will they share all of the therapeutic benefits? And also it's like relatively strong evidence that, for example, the insights and mystical experiences and that kind of things, and going through autobiographical emotions and all that kind of experiential features of the psychedelic experiences, they also seem to be quite important for the therapeutic outcomes. So yes and no, I would say.
Yeah, it's a very important question, and I feel that it's very good that there's this agreement that there's active experiments trying to figure that out. I think there's a lot of value in trying to figure out whether some of the effects of psychedelics can actually be had without the experience. This is not a a therapeutic context for use, but it's a pain managing context of use that we know that a lot of people are using psychedelics to treat either cluster headaches or migraines. Cluster headaches are one of the most painful known, disease or what you would call it. And psychedelics for many people seems to be the most effective treatment, but then a friend of mine who is treating his migraine with psychedelics has put it very well that if he has a work day and he feels that the migraine is coming on and then he takes mushrooms, well, the headache goes away, but then if he wanted to do some work during the day, that also goes away with the psychedelic trip. And of course, you can enjoy psychedelic trips just as psychedelic trips, but probably there are situations when you would just want the pain to go away. So it would be wonderful if these effects could be separated from that. And maybe some of the plasticity inducing effects could be separated from the experience. Also, there's good reasons to think that in some ways the mind and the body are the same thing in a very relevant way to this discussion. So the experience probably does matter more than some very reductionist viewpoints might suggest. But I think it's good to have the diversity. Also, like for example, now pretty much the only empathogen that is being talked about is MDMA. But probably the physical effects of MDMA, for example, related to the effects on the heart are too much for some people. So it's a good idea that we are going to have different kinds of empathogens for different contexts and for different people. I think it's good that there's a diversity of substances, and we are just at the toddler age of psychedelic research at this point. Also, it's lovely if our presuppositions end up being turned upside down. If we assume something about psychedelics and it's proven not to be true, it's nice.
All right, we have another question over there.
Thank you very much for the panel. It's been very interesting to listen to. My name is Cole Thomas. I'm a activist for more humane drug policy based here in Helsinki, and I'm a political sociologist. I usually try to look at these things from the perspective of what are the harms of prohibition, what are the harms of drug use, and how can we get rid of the harms of prohibition through legalization or regulation? How can we decrease harms and maximize benefits? So from this perspective, I wanted to ask you, if you had to legalize and regulate psychedelics, how would you do it? What kind of substances would you legalize and regulate? What would these regulations look like? How would you try to attempt to maximize benefits and minimize harms? Thank you.
I'm happy also only the moderator, so I don't have to answer. So go ahead, please.
Yeah, that's the billion euro question. No, definitely no one right answer here. That's kind of the heart of this debate. Whichever way the societies will move in the future is probably going to be something we're not likely to imagine right now. We're as Henry said, we're right now at the toddler age, and the steps that are going to probably take place in, let's say, these next 5 years, which is going to be in all likelihood mostly around the medical use of psychedelics. We have the cases of the Czechia and the Czech Republic now from this summer, very important, a big change in the EU, so the first EU country where that's gonna allow use of psilocybin in mental health care starting from next year. Maybe some examples what I believe that are not the ways to go. For example, right now, really depends on also the society, the country. What's our like, let's say, inner maturity as a society or a country? I'll give you the example of the Netherlands, a country that has always enjoyed high levels of personal liberties, but also then the personal responsibility, the collective responsibility. So even when psilocybin mushrooms were some years ago once again also prohibited, there was some legal loophole that they did that why, for example, still psilocybin is widely available in the Netherlands in the form of truffles. So you can grow psilocybin products as long as they don't sprout above ground. So truffles they stay in the soil. But point being, they're freely available to all who are 18 plus. You can just go to a random store or whichever corner, pretty much an kiosk, and okay, not an kiosk, still gonna have like a special license, we can only sell like truffles and other things there, but still very, very widely available. If it's good, let's say a shopkeeper, they're gonna be responsible. They're gonna tell you what to do, what to avoid, what to keep in mind. But the basics of harm reduction. But I mean, it's capitalism. So there's also just gonna be shopkeepers who are just gonna try to push more of the product to make more profit. So I don't think that that psychedelics should be used with capitalist market logic. Because I don't see like a positive scenario coming out of there. As far as some basics are concerned, as with what we know about brain health is that generally the later the better. So I'd say minimum like 21 plus years old. But then again, this is kind of like we're also, and it's good that we're maybe in some ways we're a bit more cautious and conservative that maybe our peers 50 years from now are looking back like, oh, those fathers, they were really like scared. But point being that right now, for example, it's even taboo to consider that these compounds could be used treating, for example, kids or teenagers. But they're really, really fascinatingly. So last year, the European Medicine Agency did a workshop about psychedelics, and their chief medical officer, I believe it is Steven Thurstrup, he pointed out a very good point that once we move onwards with these compounds and then really are going to scale them across countries, across populations, this is the subset of data we're completely lacking. There's no clinical research being done with minors as far as I know. And if we want to really use them in medicine in the future, then that's something that we need the data. We need to research that as well, and that's coming from the European Medicine Agency. So responsibilities, I would say, from a personal standpoint, just we have to be aware of course the risks, but the fact that we know how available are alcohol and nicotine, what we know about how they affect our bodies, and it really seems that the balance right now is really skewed, and it seems pretty logical that, as you mentioned, how 17-fold has increased the use of psilocybin, because people that have their personal experiences, they also kind of see the disparity or experience the disparity. Gotta be careful with the hype there, but in all likelihood, it's gonna be something like a mixture of the worlds. So you probably will be able to access these compounds in the further future also outside of the medical setting, but you will still also have the users inside the medical setting. Would be my guess. Are we talking about like 10 years, 20 years, managing expectations? But I wouldn't think anything less than that.
Yeah, if I think about the goal related to Cole's question, for me the goal would be the direction of having a healthy relationship to psychedelics. The goal of legislature is pretty much that. And in that context, I generally love the phrase, slow is steady, steady is smooth, and smooth is fast. So if we want to, as quickly as possible, arrive in a position where actually we as a society have a good, healthy, responsible, even wise relationship with psychedelics, we need to move slowly. I have an ongoing disagreement with a dear friend of mine who, the way he put it in Finnish, he said like, miksi sä Henry vittu jarruttelet? So why are you like pushing the brake on this? Like he's asking why I'm not like, for example, for instantly decriminalizing or legalizing psychedelics. And well, when it comes to decriminalization, I think it's a good thing that in Finland, especially in the bigger cities like Helsinki, the use is mostly de facto decriminalized in the way that most people who use don't get like criminal repercussions from that. But of course, the people who are the worst off are the most likely to also get the harms of prohibition, which sucks. But if I think about the Dutch example of the truffles being available, I don't see Finland doing anything like that without a long, serious political discussion. And I think the danger when it comes to going too fast is that you probably don't get, especially in the current political situation, you don't get too many opportunities to create a big change related to how we deal with psychoactive substances. So yeah, if we could just have the criminalization of the use of drugs vanish, that would probably be a good idea. But if we're going to get one shot at getting decriminalization approximately right in the next decade or 2 decades, I think it is worth thinking about how to do it in the way that is over the long term beneficial. And I think one important aspect of that is experimentality, how do you say that? Experimentaalisuus is so that there's experimentation on a small scale going on, that you, for example, have different areas that maybe have different sorts of policies, and then you compare the policies and the effects of those policies, which is what is happening in the United States now. There's different states that have their own sorts of legislature related to psychedelics. So we in the conservative North have an advance in that we can see like what kind of effects the different approaches have. Because in addition to us maybe not getting many tries of getting it approximately right away, or at least in the right direction, also some effects of drug policy change are really hard to roll back. And you see that, for example, when it comes to the legalization of cannabis in the States. So there's a lot of like profit maximization going on there that's affecting how like what kind of a context cannabis has in the society. So I think it's good to think beforehand with as a broad set of experts as possible. And here in experts I include both like researchers, but also people who use psychedelics, people who are impacted by the use of psychedelics. Have deep, slow, disagreeing discussions about how to do it. And then I hope that if a legislative change eventually comes, that it's sort of baked into that it's going to be dynamic, that we're going to improve it as we proceed, and it's already the assumption that some things will not go right away. So yeah.
What I'm saying, this is not perhaps representing the take of Psychedelic Research Association. I'm representing, but I agree with Henry that kind of research-based attitude towards like checking like which policies work and following those that work is a great idea. Also, I think the market logic has risks. And also thinking about this demarcation between that we have the therapeutic use, and I think concerning therapeutic use, it's very important that we do it like very research-based, that we don't want to kind of give therapeutic access without proper research and without evidence that this actually is working for a given mental health issue. And I think much care and careful studies are needed with that. But then the other question, like how we could find a wise relationship to psychedelics as a society. That's like another question. And I think also the prohibition, what it also does, that it stifles the development of like other alternatives. I think psychedelics could have like many different socially beneficial uses. For example, like in education of artists and clergy and all kind of stuff. Moral enhancement is one discussion in philosophy, like how could psychedelics be used as adjuncts to moral learning. And I think there are all these possibilities, and given the prohibition, none of those can be explored. And of course, like research is needed about those two, but I think much of the possibilities they could like organically develop if there would be the arena for that. And I think that's like a huge problem with the prohibition, that it kind of stifles the development of kind of socially beneficial initiatives. Although at the same time, at the moment, there is like much like plant medicine and kind of religious use of psychedelics, which is kind of illegal, but it's still happening. So yeah, it's not like black and white, but still.
Yeah, I think one important point of view also to put here is that now that the question or the public discussion is focused so much on the therapeutic, like explicitly therapeutic use of psychedelics, but it's important also to remember when we talk about like a wiser relationship of society and individuals to psychedelics, that much of psychedelic use is motivated by curiosity or the appreciation of the effects of psychedelics. There's like a strong push to argue for your use in a therapeutic set of arguments, but I think it's also a valid reason to use psychedelics, that you appreciate their effects, whatever they may be. And there was actually a very good article by the chairwoman of the Finnish Association of Psychedelic Research, Aila Mustamo, who is a folklorist and an anthropologist. She wrote about how cannabis was handled in the 19th century Romantic literature. And there is the glaring observation is that there's the absence of trying to argue that the use needs to be argued from the perspective of benefit. But this is just something that people do. Some people find it interesting and are drawn towards it. Other people are not. But so I'm not saying that this should be put in the focus of the societal discussion, but also I think it's just a point of view that needs to be remembered also. And also when it comes to the wiser handling, that maybe think about psychedelics as we think about any extreme activities like diving or mountain climbing or riding a horse. You need to know the risks, and you need to have communities that help in being aware of the risks when you make decisions.
I would also be cautious about the market logics around the legalization of psychedelics. And I also agree that a lot of push has been towards the use of psychedelics in therapy, but I think it's equally important to speak about the recreational or ritualistic or spiritual reasons. So in my ideal vision, how I would like to see is that there would be places, institutions where it's safe, where it's guided, and where is also medical aid available, where people can use psychedelics. Perhaps I'm inspired by my own experiences in Peru, which is not to say that Peru is completely unproblematic. There are also exploitations of the indigenous communities and lots of this kind of extraction of resources or money happening around the hype of ayahuasca boom in Peru. But on the other hand, I appreciate an opportunity to have a psychedelic experience in a controlled, supported settings with guidance, with quality of substance, with potential medical aid available or psychedelic aid available. So I think this is where I would like to see it in a culture, not widely available in the truffle shops. Yeah.
Thank you for these comments. Thank you for these questions. There might have been more in the audience, but I'm afraid because of time, we have to wrap this up. Just one last round of you can promote your associations or what you're doing yourself. I'm going to start by mentioning that because decriminalization was mentioned, our organization is developing a citizens initiative of decriminalization of all drugs, including psychedelics. If you're interested, join our association and you'll learn more and you can be part of it as well. And just to quickly mention that indeed tomorrow Psykedeelic conference starts in Turku. Few spots left, so do come to Turku. But let's just go one round if you want to say something to close it.
I recommend everybody to follow the Finnish Association for Psychedelic Research. I think we are doing quite a good job, and there is lots of webinars and different events also for the general public. I myself, I'm also teaching a course in the University of Helsinki next spring in philosophy of psychedelics. So if you are in the University of Helsinki, please join that.
First one in Finland, I guess.
Yeah, first, probably also the first university course on psychedelics in summer.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Well, I just want to express my appreciation for this kind of regional cooperation. I think this is, the path to move onwards in the future as well in the Nordics. So yes, together with fellow team members from TYPE, we'll also be attending Psykedeelic 2025 in Turku tomorrow. And yeah, we also plan to do the first proper conference about psychedelics in Estonia next year as well. The dates are not out right now yet, but yeah, do keep an eye on us as well. And yeah, we hope to see each other more in similar context and events in the region.
Yeah, thank you for this conversation. I would have loved to go on for a couple of hours more with you guys. Thank you for your patience for me not being able to speak shortly. It's not a talent of mine. If you're interested in our organization, I encourage you to follow us on social media or order our newsletter. We have regular events in Helsinki and also now a bit in other cities, a bit in Tampere and this fall hopefully in Turku. There on the table you can see a list of some of the lectures and conversations that we've had during this year and will have during the rest of this year. And we also organize regular movie documentary screenings and stuff like that. And also if you're interested in engaging in these kinds of conversations, I invite you to consider becoming a member, applying for a full membership maybe in the organization. Also I recommend that for people who are interested in the research part. So Psykedeeliavusteisten, the research association, is a good place for networking for students and professionals who work or are studying in fields relevant to psychedelic research. And for the culture organization, Psykedeellisen sivistyksen liitto, do contact us, do give us suggestions on what kind of lectures or discussions or documentary screenings or whatever you would like to have. And also thank you, Aleksi and Rumani Päihdepolitiikka for initiating this. As I said to Aleksi before, this topic is one that we also probably should have worked more to put to the front or publicize it. So I'm really grateful that you did this, invited us to come.
Well, I'm also super thankful for showing the film in such an exciting context. It's been really interesting to think about Soviet hippies in terms of psychedelic therapy, and it's been also very engaging to hear your thoughts, and the work you do is amazing. So thank you again, Alexi, for inviting me, and thanks for the audience. And in terms of ayahuasca in Peru, I have made a short documentary about the kind of critical view on the ayahuasca boom in Peru. If anyone is interested, I can send you the link if you email me. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, the audience. Thank you, Millainen Lähde, for having us here again. And thank you, Otto Am Home Foundation, for making this happen as well. And thank you. Kiitos. Aitäh.